So early on, in the early years of the colonies, everything that they had to make themselves. So if they wanted whatever they wanted, they had to get the raw materials. A lot of times they brought those in from England, but they had to make it themselves. Everything was homemade. Then the Industrial Revolution started, and we started getting machines. People started building machines that were able to replace handmade things. So factories started coming up, and everything didn't have to be made by hand. So then that reduced your cost when you were able to mass produce things. So instead of somebody working on a dress and it taking them 2 days to make a dress, now we have machines that could mass produce them. So it costs less per item, because now we had a growing middle class. We had people working and they had money to spend, but they couldn't spend. They didn't want to spend as much on what they were buying. And so the machines definitely helped to reduce that cost to make things affordable. We also had Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. So that made it to where a lot more cotton was able to be produced. It was to be able to be cleaned. It definitely increased the production of cotton. So more cloth was then able to be made because we had more cotton. So that increased our textile companies. And it costs less because the cotton gin was able to could do 50 times what a person can do today. So the definite negative to the cotton gin is because we could process more cotton, now farmers wanted to plant more cotton. So when they wanted to plant more cotton, they took more land from the Native Americans to have it to plant, but then slavery expanded greatly during this because they wanted more slaves to plant the cotton and raise the cotton so that the cotton gin could come through and process it. So while the cotton gin was a great technological advancement, it really helped farmers be able to process their cotton. It was really bad, and that it increased our slavery. There are also boarding houses started coming in. So young girls from normally poor farm families, they would go to work in these factories, producing whatever it was the factory produced. They would come to cities and they would build these little villages around the boarding house, which is where these girls would stay. So they would come in, they would leave their homes, and they were going to make money because the family needed money. And they'd go work 12 and 13 hours a day for 6 days a week. It was really hard work, and a lot of times these factories weren't super safe, so it wasn't always safe work. But they would live in these boarding houses. So it would be all these girls that worked in the factory, and they would pay their room and their board because, they had to pay for food and almost like rent. And then any money that was left over, they would send back to their families to help them out. We also had some farming advancements. So John Deere came up with the plow that was able to really help farmers get through some of that the roots and everything in the ground to be able to have more plowable land. And we also had interchangeable parts come up. So that meant that if something broke, like we do now, if something on your car breaks, you normally don't buy a new car, you fix that part. If something in your house breaks, if your stove breaks and it's just one part of the stove, if it's just one burner on your stove, you can go buy a new burner. You don't necessarily have to buy a whole new stove. So before interchangeable parts, if something broke, they couldn't really do anything about it. They didn't sell the parts for it, so you'd have to buy a whole new whatever it was. So then they started coming up with these interchangeable parts like we have now, so that if something went bad, you didn't have to replace the entire machine, piece of equipment, whatever it was. You could just replace specific parts, and that definitely helped. That saved a lot of money for people because then they were able to afford to replace those things, whereas they couldn't have afforded if they had to replace the entire. The lesson gives the example of guns. So if one thing on the gun went wrong, they have to replace the whole thing. Well, they might not be able to afford to do that, but they could afford the one interchangeable part, and then that takes a lot of that waste away.